Welcome and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, the last day of our spring quarter classes. I'll begin this afternoon with the land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Hello, I'm Kimberly Lynn, current department chair, and on behalf of the Department of Global Humanities and Religions at Western Washington University and the Western Washington University Alumni Association, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. This event marks the department's 12th annual Distinguished Speaker and the first on Zoom. The department offers an interdisciplinary humanities curriculum with courses ranging ancient to modern, spanning the globe, and focusing in particular on cultural history and religious studies. To introduce our speaker and moderate the rest of today's event, I'll now turn the presentation over to Ethan Bushell, our department specialist in Japanese religions and culture.
Good afternoon, everyone. And to begin, I just want to start with a little housekeeping. Some of you have submitted questions with your registration, and we thank you for doing so. We have those noted. And we also encourage you to submit questions via the Zoom Q&A feature, which will be at the bottom of your screen, bottom middle of your screen. And after Eric's talk is over, around about 45, 50 minutes, I, as your moderator, will field those questions and read them on your behalf for the Q&A. Also, so that you can see both Professor Swanson, the speaker, and the PowerPoint, we also recommend that you use the speaker view in your Zoom window. And with that, I'd like to get started. And thank you, Professor Lin, for the introduction. My name is Ethan Bushell, Professor of East Asian Religions and Culture in the Department of Global Humanities and Religion here at Western Washington University. And it is my distinct pleasure to present to you today our distinguished speaker, Professor Eric Swanson of the Department of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. Professor Swanson received his PhD in Japanese Buddhist Studies from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University in 2019. He is the author of numerous articles, translations, and reviews that have been published in leading academic journals, as well as the popular independent magazine Tricycle. And within the field of Japanese Buddhist studies, Professor Swanson specializes in the study of a form of Buddhism known in Japanese as Mikkyo and in English as Esoteric Buddhism, or sometimes by the Sanskrit term Tantric Buddhism. Within the Esoteric Buddhist tradition specifically, he is particularly interested in its diverse array of rites for the subjugation of evil. And his attention to this issue of ritual subjugation has been really groundbreaking, as it provides a much needed corrective to prevailing understandings of Buddhism. For too long, not only in mainstream media in the West, but also even in the academic study of religion, Buddhism has been understood as a rational religion, a systematic path to enlightenment or salvation that centers on meditation and dispassionate contemplation. But what Professor Swanson's work shows so compellingly, and what I anticipate we'll learn today in his talk entitled Conquering Evil and Peace of Mind, Negotiating Salvation in Esoteric Buddhism in Medieval Japan, is that the picture of Japanese Buddhism as a rational salvation religion is, in part at least, the product of a process of negotiation and reinvention that can be traced back to late 19th century Japan, as clerics of the Shingon school of Japanese esoteric Buddhism sought to remake their tradition in a way that would accord with Western secularist assumptions about the kind of religion that would be conducive for the flourishing of an enlightened modern nation state. Professor Swanson's archaeology of the Japanese Buddhist tradition, his uncovering of its sedimented layers of practice and belief concealed from our modern eyes, has, speaking personally, greatly impacted my own understanding of Buddhism in Japan, and I have no doubt that his talk today will go a long way in opening up new vistas of interpretation for each of you as well. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Swanson.
Okay, thank you so much, Ethan, for your kind introduction and for the overview of what I'm about to talk about. I almost feel like I don't need to give the talk anymore since that's such a great introduction. I do want to kind of start off by thanking the members of the Department of Global Humanities and Religions, the Western Washington University Alumni Association, for your kind support of this event. Dr. Kimberly Lin and Dr. Ethan Bushell and Maureen Chrisman for organizing and coordinating this event, and Janine for the technical support. Without your support, we would be lost, I'm sure. And finally, I wanted to thank all of you in the audience today for joining us, especially here at the end of what I think we can all agree was a very challenging academic year. As I'll be discussing this idea of peace of mind, or anjin, I think it's only appropriate that we begin with maybe a short moment of silence, just to recognize for a moment everything that happened this past year, all that we've lost, both collectively and perhaps also individually as well. So if you can just join me in a quick moment of silence. So thank you again for being here. I wish that I could see all of your faces. I must admit it's quite awkward to, even though I've had the chance to speak on Zoom multiple times, I still find it quite awkward. But if there's one positive thing to come out of this past year, it's perhaps the fact that we can meet and interact in this digital platform in a way that was quite unimaginable just a few years ago, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to present on this topic, something which is actually quite new to me as well. So let me share my screen. So the title of my talk is Conquering Evil and Peace of Mind, Negotiating Salvation in Esoteric Buddhism, Meiji Japan. So when Ethan reached out to me about this talk, I initially thought of focusing just on this notion of the conquering of evil in medieval esoteric Buddhism. But as we started discussing further, I decided I'd like to use this opportunity to look into this idea of the peace of mind as it was articulated in modern Japan in the 19th century. I'm interested in the notion of salvation in esoteric Buddhist tradition and how it was conceptualized and negotiated across different time periods, both in pre-modern and modern Japan and across Japanese religious history. I understand that there's people zooming in from around the world, and as such, I will do my best to try to explain things in a way that's perhaps accessible to the non-specialists, while also pointing to what I think are some fascinating details in both the historical context and the negotiation of salvation that we see in the esoteric Buddhist tradition in two different time periods in Japanese history. So a quick overview of today's talk. It'll be divided into four different parts. The first is a brief introduction to the Meiji period. It would just kind of laying the foundations of what is the Meiji period. The second will be specifically on the critiques of Japanese Buddhism in the Meiji period, especially is Buddhism as this kind of antiquated tradition, and how the Japanese Buddhist institutions are responding to that. The third will actually kind of transfers back to the 9th century in Japan and kind of the inception of the early stages of esoteric Buddhism in Japan, and think about how there's discussions of conquering evil and how that developed and really you could just kind of see it in the earliest stages of esoteric Buddhism. And then fourth, I'll jump back to the Meiji period and this issue of modernization and focus specifically on discourses of the peace of mind, or anjin, in esoteric Buddhism. So before I start, I just want to quickly show you some of the kind of recent publications on Buddhism in Meiji Japan. And I think that, as you see here, these are only just a small sample, but this kind of focus of the Meiji period in Japan and this issue of modernization in Japanese Buddhism specifically has been a quite a hot topic in Japanese religion and the study of Japanese religions. And I hope that my work on anjin, this kind of peace of mind, can be in conversation with a lot of these already great pieces of scholarship. So let me begin with a basic overview of what's happening during the Meiji period that makes it such an interesting topic or time period to study. The Meiji period was a period marked with the introduction of a number of governmental reforms and drastically changed the religious landscape, forcing many religious institutions to reevaluate their understanding of their teachings and their roles in society. Today, I hope to focus on discussions that occurred within the Shingon Buddhist tradition, one of the esoteric Buddhist traditions in Japan. The first thing to note about the Meiji period was how there was a significant shift in the political power. In the year 1868, the Tokugawa shogun, who ruled Japan in the feudal period prior to the Meiji period, lost their power, and the Japanese emperor was restored to the supreme position. The emperor took the name Meiji, which can be translated as Great Governance, as his reign name. This came to be known as the Reiji Restoration. When the Meiji emperor was restored as the head of Japan, the nation was primarily agricultural, had little technological development. It was controlled by hundreds of semi-independent feudal lords, and was a militarily weak country, especially compared to the other colonial empires of the time. With the abolition of feudalism came tremendous social and political changes in Japan. People were suddenly free to choose their occupation, and the government made possible investment in new industries and technologies, building railway, shipping lines, telephone systems, and various consumer industries. The government also introduced a national education system and a new constitution, creating an elected parliament called the Diet, which was modeled after Western nations. They did this to provide a good environment for national growth and building support for the establishment of what would be considered the modern state of Japan. Specifically important for today's talk, in 1872, the government established a national system to educate the entire population. By the end of the Meiji period, almost everyone attended free public schools for at least 6 years. And the government closely controlled the schools, making sure that in addition to skills like mathematics and readings, all students studied something called moral training, which stressed the importance of their duty to the emperor, their new ruler, the country and their families, a topic that we will return to in today's talk. In close relationship to the mobilization efforts to modernize Japan, was this idea that they would compete on the world stage with Western nations. And the Meiji leaders created a civic ideology centered around the emperor. Although the emperor wielded no political power, he was presented as a symbol of Japanese culture, as well as the head of the Shinto religion. Japan's was often called Japan's native religion. According to Shinto beliefs, the emperor was a semi-divine descendant in a long lineage that could be traced back to the sun goddess. And particularly significant in our talk today, Meiji reformers strategically brought the emperor and Shinto to national prominence, replacing Buddhism as the national religion for political and ideological reasons. By emphasizing this notion of the imperial line within Shinto tradition that traced back to mythical times, Japan was presented as having a powerful symbolic a national unity, and much effort was placed in ensuring this collective identity was instilled within its people. Another key component to consider in the Meiji period was the new competition posed by Christianity. Although unfortunately today I won't be able to discuss that in detail. To get a general sense of what's happening in the Meiji period, not only the restoration, but kind of the early stages of this period, and especially with regards to the place of religion within broader discussions of modernity, we can look to Hayashi Makoto, a historian of religion who proposed a new periodization of the history of modern Buddhism in Japan. According to Hayashi, in making sense of the modernization of Buddhism, it's important that we recognize the struggles seen within the Buddhist institution itself as it responded to the rapidly shifting political structures from Tokugawa feudalism to the Meiji state. He also suggests that we see it as a gradual process in which he sees it largely in a three-part process of dismantling a centuries-old religious system within its own intrinsic rationale. I think that's a really important point that he makes. This internal negotiation that occurs within the Buddhist institution is what I'm interested in addressing today, with specific emphasis on what the Shingon school is doing, one of the esoteric Buddhist traditions in Japan. Furthermore, the treatises that I will look at fall under this second period, the age of doctrinal instructor from 1872 to 1884. So I'll focus my discussion mainly on what's happening in this particular section. So in 1870, the imperial decree on the Great Promulgation Campaign was issued in part as an attempt to remove Buddhism from public sphere and transfer the social functions held by Buddhist temples to Shinto shrines. This edict asserted the unity of ritual and government, established the office of senkyoshi, or the propagandists, who were given the task to instruct the nation on the great way of obedience to the gods. Importantly, in this process, Buddhist priests were deliberately excluded from participating in this campaign. However, the office of propagandist was short-lived and abolished by the mid-1872 and was replaced by the Ministry of Religious Education, or the Kyobusho. Their role was reformulated and incorporated into the newly created office of the doctrinal instructor, or the Kyodo Shoku. The main role of the doctrinal instructor was to preach to the population based on the three standards of instruction, which were as follows: to embody reverence for the deities and love of the country; second, to clarify the principles of heaven and the way of humanity; and last, to revere and assist the emperor and to obey the will of the court. So these changes seen between 1870s and the early 1880s opened up the floor for Buddhists to get involved, and the Buddhists in different denominations had to reevaluate their own positions based on these institutional changes. These institutional changes, which created a space that was somewhere between the role of an educator and that of their original priesthood. The office of the doctrinal instructor, however, also quickly lost importance, and it was clear that it was just a matter of time until this would be abolished as well. In other words, as Buddhists attempted to carve out a space for themselves as these new educators for the Meiji government, they were also placed in a very precarious state. This precarious state, however, led to the production of treatises that attempted to reestablish the significance of their own traditions in Meiji Japan, whether that was claiming its superiority over other Buddhist denominations, or whether their critique was directed to a kind of more common enemy of Christianity. So I'll now turn to some examples of this distinction of the old and new Buddhism that arose in the Meiji period around this time. So in his study of the invention of religion in Japan, Hisan the Josephson introduces Tsuda Mamichi as an example of, of how the search for modernist Japan based on Christian and scientific values went hand in hand with a harsh critique of Buddhism as superstitious. In his essays, Methods of Advancing Enlightenment, published in 1874, Tsuda demarcates the limits of enlightenment, claiming that there is empty learning that belongs to Buddhist discussions of non-existence and nirvana, that is based on intuitive knowledge, and there is practical learning that solely explains the factual principles through observation and verification, pointing to the sciences, astronomy, physics, chemistry, medicine, political economy, and philosophy of the modern West. In his promotion of enlightenment and the advancement of civilization in Meiji Japan, Tsuda blamed Japanese religions, particularly Buddhism, for promoting these backward beliefs of ghosts, monsters, and the demonic. For Tsuda, Buddhism was corrupt for its role in promoting and claiming to exorcise demons, while concluding that Protestant Christianity specifically was more amenable to a modern civilization. Josephson sees this construction of the category of superstition, pointing to the vestiges of older conceptions of evil and the demonic, as inseparable from the invention of the concept of religion in Japan, and as a marker for beliefs that should not be believed in. As we will see, this harsh critique of superstition, while applied to Japanese Buddhism overall, could be particularly addressing the practices associated with esoteric Buddhism. Another example of the harsh criticism of so-called antiquated ways of Buddhist institutions can be seen in the writings of Nakanishi Ushiro, who was known as a religious thinker of Meiji Japan. In 1887, Nakanishi completed his first book, Treatise on the Religious Revolution, which was published in 1889. In his multiple publications, he presented what he understood to be the relationship between Buddhism and civilization, and argued that the Meiji Reformation was one step in the much needed revolution of religion, or Shūkyō Kakumei. In his discussion of this change, it's important to note that Nakanishi used Christianity and the history of the West as a frame of reference, suggesting that just as the Roman Catholicism went through a reformation and into Protestantism, the older antiquated form of Buddhism must be reformed to a new Buddhism. Although his views on new Buddhism was met with some criticism from his contemporaries, it was highly regarded, particularly among the young Buddhists who were interested in the new kind of possibilities of the Buddhist teachings in their efforts to modernize Japanese society. So what exactly did Nakanishi say about new Buddhism, and what was his critique of old Buddhism? I've listed a very useful list that was created by Hoshino Seiji in his article on the subject. Here we can see a very clear distinction between what he viewed as old and new forms of Buddhism. So he said, new Buddhism is progressive, old Buddhism is conservative, new is open to common people, while old is elitist. New is spiritual, while old is materialistic. New is based on faith, while old is based on learning and scholasticism. New is active in society, where old is satisfied where it is. New is historical, while old is dogmatic, and new is based on reason, while old still clings to superstitions. This demarcation between new and old Buddhism, as one can see, is laid out very clearly. It was precisely the clarity, and perhaps one can say the simplicity, in these distinctions between the new as the desired future of Buddhism and the old as that which needs to be reformed, that made it such an influential framework that gained traction in Meiji Japan. In fact, this rather simplified distinction voiced by figures like Nakanishi between new and old Buddhism had concrete consequences in the discussion of the future of Buddhism and in the actual assessment of historical or their contemporaries. There was a very interesting study by Kamiyama Mitsuhiro on the Shingon priest Shaku Unsho, where he points to the way in which a prominent Shingon figure, esoteric Buddhist figure, quickly changed in light of this distinction between old and new Buddhists. In the publication of a journal called Bukkyo or Buddhism and Shinbukkyo, New Buddhism, in the early 1890s, there could be seen submissions of essays by Shaku Unsho, a prominent figure within the Shingon tradition. But however, by the late 1890s, the same figure of Shaku Unsho came to be presented as an exemplar of old Buddhism. In other words, as a conservative, elitist, and superstitious. This quick transition of a Buddhist figure's public face seen through these journals suggests the rapidly shifting and tense environment of Meiji period polemics. As these examples indicate, the early to mid Meiji period was a time of reimagining of the role of religious institutions in Japanese society. Although the call for reform within Buddhist institutions were applied across the board to all Buddhist schools and denominations, as was the case with Shaku Unsho's, one could say that the esoteric Buddhist tradition became an easy target in the critique of Buddhism as antiquated, elitist, materialistic, dogmatic, and superstitious. While this characterization of old Buddhism is a simplification of the dynamic development of esoteric Buddhism throughout Japanese history, one can point to specific aspects of the tradition where, for example, the subjugation or conquering of evil played an important role in the development of its history, but also in discussions of the role of the esoteric Buddhist practitioner in establishing a peaceful world. In the next section, I will look at a couple examples of these early discussions of the conquering of evil as an important aspect of esoteric Buddhism's ritual culture. So for the Shingon school, one of the two major esoteric Buddhist traditions that developed in Japan is today mostly associated with Kukai, the Japanese Buddhist monk, calligrapher, poet, and founder of the esoteric Shingon school of Buddhism. In critiquing the view of Kukai as a founder figure of the Shingon school, Ryuichi Abe argued in The Weaving of Mantra, Kukai and the Construction of Esoteric Buddhist Discourse, that Kukai's most important contribution to early Heian society, 9th century society, needs to be understood within the historical context of his time. His important contribution, according to Abe, was not that he established the Shingon school, but rather that he responded to the needs of his contemporaries in his construction of an esoteric Buddhist discourse that consisted of a new language theory and ritual system. Kukai envisioned esoteric Buddhism as providing a new linguistic foundation of religious discourse essential for maintaining social order, and established a new relationship between the imperial family or imperial order and the Buddhist establishment. However, it's also important to recognize that discourses regarding esoteric Buddhism continued to be negotiated in the years following Kukai's death, especially in some of the most important innovations seen in the way esoteric Buddhist rituals were were presented as rituals that would bring peace to the land. Even in the early years of the development of esoteric Buddhism in Japan, there was a continued negotiation of the rapprochement between the Japanese state and the Buddhist establishment in the years after Kukai, through the establishment of these new forms of ritual practices. One such innovation was an attempt to amplify the very force of mantra, or these kind of esoteric Buddhist spells, as a means to counter and subjugate growing perceptions of the presence of evil among ruling elite of the Heian capital, the capital at the time. As scholar Hayami Tasuku has suggested in Heian, in his study, new forms of rituals appeared after Kukai's time that amplified the role of esoteric Buddhist ritual practice as effective in subjugation of evil, malevolent threats. The Taigensui ritual and the Shijoko ritual that I will address today are prime examples of this new form of ritual. However, it's also important to note that with the rise of these new forms of ritual, we can discern the appearance of new negotiations between the amplification of the forceful and violent side of the function of esoteric ritual power on the one hand, and attempt to frame these ritual practices within a broader Mahayana framework that focuses compassion and the salvation of all beings. A point that is clearly dismissed in the polemical attacks of the old or antiquated Buddhism seen in Meiji intellectuals. This is something I also hope to touch on. When we speak about the subjugation of evil in esoteric Buddhism, perhaps no better place to start than to introduce the wrathful figure of Taigensui Myo that we see depicted here. This wrathful figure was the object of veneration in the Taigenho ritual, which was practiced for the protection of the state, and specifically for the subjugation of one's enemy, or onteki choboku. It was Jogyo, one of Kukai's disciples, who was first to import a complete ritual set that was necessary to perform this ritual. In Jogyo's catalog of important items, he emphasized that this ritual was one that had yet to be fully transmitted to Japan, and that no other ritual can compare to its power of preventing calamities. He also asserted that if the ruler and his ministers revered the Taigensui Myo, that there would be no further threats from evil thieves, no more epidemics, and the heavens will be calm. Another important emphasis was that the Tang officials revered the ritual as a treasure for governing the state, and a ritual essential for being victorious against his enemies. All of this were important claims amplified to convince the court of the necessity of establishing this ritual for maintaining peace. In the year 847, Jogyo requested that this ritual be performed at Horinji in Uji district for the protection of the state, and his request was immediately approved. Following his success in the year 851, Jogyo requested that the ritual be performed annually within the imperial palace, a precedent set by the establishment of the Mishiho ritual by Kukai. The quick reception of the ritual needs to be understood as having to do with the growing anxieties within the court regarding the rising potential of disorder in the land. Among these anxieties were concerns of pirates attacking ships off the coast of Japan near present-day Hakata, as well as worries regarding the possibility of a military revolution in neighboring lands, referring specifically to the Silla dynasty. It was amid these growing tensions that rumors appeared in 870 that Fujiwara no Morimaro was conspiring a Silla court to raise a rebellion against the court. At this time, there was an edict that was issued that stated, "The rebellious criminals of the neighboring state shall be subdued through the power of Taigensui." In this way, the quick reception and the sudden rise in the importance of Taigensui ritual can be understood as intrinsically connected to the growing concerns and anxieties felt against the impending threats from neighboring territories and that these rites addressed concerns of the ruling elite of the Heian capital. The establishment of new forms of rituals that purported to eliminate malevolent forces also developed on Mount Hiei around the same time, also involving the request by the ruling elite. Returning to Mount Hiei in 848 after spending 9 years in Tang, China, on a mission to bring back the latest Buddhist teachings and practices, Ennin was graded by from his peers on Mount Hiei, and equally by those at the court with very high expectations. The anticipation and trust that was placed in Ennin is also evident in how he was approached in 850, just 2 years after his return to Mount Hiei, for the accession ritual of the new emperor, Emperor Montoku. Ennin suggested that the most appropriate ritual to be performed was the ritual of the Shijoko Butjo, the radiant light of the Buddha's crown. Ennin explained, in removing calamity and attaining fortune, there is no superior method than the Shijoko Butjo ritual. It is for this reason that the ritual is practiced in the Naidojo of the Tang Imperial Palace for the protection of the state. It is imperative to establish a practice ground in a Goma platform and to practice this ritual for the benefit of the emperor. End quote. What is striking about this proposition by Ennin is that all of the points made here suggest that Ennin not only legitimized his claims by showing his new ritual project related to specific locations associated with Kukai's own establishment of the Misho rituals, but that he suggested that this ritual was even better than that as the latest development of ritual practices, which he personally witnessed during his travels. According to the record of the Sandai Jitsuroku, the first performance of the Shijoko ritual was undertaken in 850 following these exchanges. While the iconography seen here associated with the Shijobukko is particular one found in the Asabasho that was compiled in the 13th century, doesn't express the same form of wrath that we see in the Taigensui Myo introduced above. The content of the sutra that is associated with this ritual uses a similar rhetoric that emphasized that this ritual is a majestic method to eliminate all forms of impending threats. In the text, instructions on the Dharma wheel to remove calamities as expounded by the great sage, excellently auspicious Bodhisattva Manjushri, that's a very long title, explains, quote, when one with clairvoyance predicts the spread of great epidemics and demonic spirits, or the rise of violent soldiers and bandits who attempt to invade one's people, the emperor should put up a mandala, and with a mind of reverence should pray daily for the protection of the land. If this is done, one shall be victorious and the evil bandits will be eliminated. End quote. The sutra goes on to explain that the vengeful enemies, evil diseases, spirits from previous lifetimes are all potential threats that can be subverted through this ritual practice. According to the short sutra, providing correct instructions to the astral deities can prevent the various calamities, and this is done through the radiant light that is emitted from every pore of the Buddha's body, which outshines and subdues the astral deities that surround him. Here, the purpose of subduing potentially malevolent forces is a key component to the ritual. It's also significant that the ritual process proposes to assist the emperor or other patrons at times when they are faced with impending social or political threats. As seen here in the years immediately following Kukai's passing, there was a growing emphasis on the establishment of rituals that promised to counter malevolent threats with ever more majestic ritual methods. However, in a treatise written by the same figure, Ennin, Sochikara-kyo Ryakusho, a commentary of the Suddhikara Sutra composed in 855, indicates that he was quite aware of the need to carefully negotiate and clarify potential misunderstandings that might arise regarding the rhetoric of violence seen in these rituals that propose to subjugate demonic figures. Ennin seems to understand that the emphasis of subjugation brings up important issues for the Buddhist practitioner. What implications might this have to the notion of the Bodhisattva ideal of compassion and saving others. Ennin addresses this issue through an interlocutor who asks, if subjugation ritual destroys various malicious beings like demons, evil people, snakes, dragons, and the like, does that not constitute as killing? In response to this question, Ennin responds, according to the commentary by Yixing, the meaning of devouring is for the wrathful ones to swallow the various vinayakas. If it is practiced in accordance to what you speak of, it is indeed a crime for the Buddhas and to kill sentient beings. However, it's revealed in the esoteric teachings that the Vinayaka are responsible for all obstructions, and that all obstructions rise from one's deluded mind. If you devour these obstructions, the afflictions of your mind and eyes will be clear. What is called true wrath is to devour the obstructions of all sentient beings to the gate of the letter Kya. This is the work of the Tathagata, the practices practiced by the Buddha. You should consider this deeply, end quote. Here, Ennin emphasizes the importance of the practitioner of esoteric Buddhist ritual to understand that the act of subjugation is conducted within the context of ritual practice, and specifically as the act of an enlightened being. To engage in the act of wrath is not the same as real violence that intends to inflict harm or take life away. Rather, it's important that one conduct subjugation with the understanding that the object of subjugation is none other than the Vinayaka, which arises within one's deluded mind. If one misunderstands this, they are in the danger of committing a crime and will accrue the appropriate karmic consequences for their actions. Ennin also emphasizes the importance of the practitioner's correct mindset. Specific instructions include warnings against a ritual practitioner to feel aversion towards the heavenly spirits, beings depicted as those who will be coerced within the ritual practice. Ennin elaborates on the notion of heavenly spirits and says this includes the various spirits and kami of the heavens and the earth, and further emphasizes that this should be understood as saints that deserve reverence. Ennin also points to the temptation of the practitioner to employ mantras to bind people down to bring down one's enemies, and comments on practitioners who use spells to battle to show off one's supernatural skills. In response to these topics, Ennin provides a clear explanation of why these modes of thought should be avoided. They will go against the mind and conduct of a bodhisattva. He explains at one point, if feelings of aversion arise in you, this is the same as turning your back on your parents. How can this not bring ruin to the bodhisattva's vow to save all? End quote. When we consider that Ennin decided to compose a commentary as part of his effort to establish the foundation of training of esoteric Buddhist practice on Mount Hiei, where he resided, one may be able to conclude that while Ennin understood the need to appeal to patrons with esoteric Buddhist rituals that promised majestic methods to avert threats through ritual subjugation, this is also precisely the reason why it was necessary to instruct further future practitioners that proper conduct and mindset was not only key to achieve successful results, but also required to maintain basic ideals of the compassionate practice of the bodhisattva in the Buddhist teachings. At the same time, emphasis was also placed on the understanding that ritual practitioners act as Buddhas, with the purpose of leading all beings, including malevolent spirits, towards liberation, not as an unenlightened figure. It was, in other words, carefully presented as a Buddhist form of salvation. What do these discussions regarding the subjugation of evil enemies in the esoteric tradition tell us? It suggests that even in the earliest developments of the esoteric Buddhism in Japan, ritual practitioners were encouraged to take seriously the notion of evil obstructions and view the esoteric teachings as particularly effective means to counter these obstructions. In this sense, perhaps the critique of old Buddhism seen in Meiji Japan as concerned with the exorcism of demons seemed to ring true to a certain extent. However, it's also important to recognize that in taking the notion of evil seriously, careful negotiations were made between the amplification of the need to use more powerful methods to vanquish evil on the one hand, and to clarify on the other how they can still be understood as operating in accordance to broader concerns of compassion and salvation within the Buddhist teachings. The simple rejection of old Buddhism as being superstitious ignores the tension that we see even in the earliest developments of the esoteric Buddhist tradition in Japan, of how salvation was negotiated as Buddhist practitioners encountered scriptures that clearly stated that the violent subjugation of evil spirits was a proposed function of these rites. The other critique, however, that the old Buddhists, in other words, that the old Buddhists were elitists, could also be seen in these examples. While there are exceptions, many of the esoteric rituals were performed to the patronage of elite imperial family and aristocrats, and were often for the protection and care of either the bodies of the patrons and the success of their elite lineages, or the rituals were performed for the protection of the state in response to droughts, famine, social unrest, etc. The role of esoteric Buddhist practice as supporting the ruling elite was, in fact, one prominent characteristic of Shingon Buddhism, although not the only one. And in fact, can be also seen expressed by Meiji period Shingon monks as well. For example, the treatise by Shingon monk Shaku Unsho on the national doctrine of Greater Japan, Dai Nippon Kokkyoron, translated by Kameyama Mitsuhiro and included in the recently published Buddhism and Modernity volume, show that one of the clear intentions behind the production of the treatise was to claim that esoteric Buddhist tradition of Shingon Buddhism was the so-called original school of the imperial house. The notion that Buddhism should be a national religion, with Shingon esoteric Buddhism as the most fitting Buddhist school to serve the Meiji Emperor, was a characteristic of the esoteric Buddhist institution not only critiqued by new Buddhists, but also embraced and seen as a part of the Shingon Buddhist identity both in 9th century Japan and the Meiji period in the 19th century. The discourse of new and old Buddhism was, however, clearly driven by institutional polemics, and many of the Buddhist intellectuals that were at the forefront of these discussions on the role of Buddhism in modernizing society were associated with the Shin Pure Land traditions. However, we should not ignore the fact that figures within the Shingon school were also responding in their own ways. Kameyama's recent research on Shaku Unsho and his precept revival movement in Meiji Japan, for example, is a wonderful treatment of the Shingon figures of the Meiji period, and especially notable as the majority of the studies have tended to focus on prominent intellectuals associated with Shin Pure Land Buddhism, whereas there's been very little research on the esoteric Buddhist tradition and their responses in the Meiji period. In hope to shed a little bit more light on Shingon Buddhism in Meiji Japan, for the remainder of this talk, I will focus on the Shingon discourses of the peace of mind, or anjin, as seen in the publications, which illustrates a negotiation of salvation within the esoteric Buddhist tradition, as Shingon Buddhism priests reimagined the significance of their teachings within the rapidly changing social landscape of Meiji Japan in the 19th century. It's perhaps important to note that the term anjin, seen here, or the peace of mind, was traditionally associated more with the Shin Pure Land Buddhism, which used the term anjin ketsujo, which basically translates to a determined peace of mind, or the determination of a peace of mind, to refer to one's faith in the salvific power of the Amitabha Buddha of the Western Pure Land in Buddhism. The main practice of Pure Land Buddhism is the chanting of Amitabha's name. The practice is simple, but great emphasis is placed on the recognition of one's inability to attain enlightenment on their own, and to have complete faith in the salvific power of the Amitabha Buddha. Often referred to as the other power, followers of Shin Pure Land Buddhism achieve salvation through their acceptance of Amitabha's endless compassion, and through letting oneself be embraced, completely embraced by this Amitabha Buddha's compassion. In other words, the peace of mind as articulated in Pure Land Buddhism was associated specifically with the gaining of relief in one's complete faith in a specific Buddha, the Amitabha Buddha of the Western Pure Land. Regardless of any doctrinal associations we can make to the Pure Land teachings through the term anjin, or peace of mind, What was perhaps more crucial in understanding why we see an emergence of the discourse of peace of mind within Shingon Buddhism in Meiji Japan was a growing concern of the need to proselytize the Shingon teachings and the necessity to make the teachings more accessible to a broader audience. As the term esoteric indicates, the Shingon Buddhist teachings that provided the theoretical foundation for the elaborate rituals performed by Shingon monks were traditionally described in difficult language, both doctrinally and in terms of ritual complexity. And especially compared to the simplicity of Pure Land teachings and practices, they were quite complicated and cloaked in secrecy. The initiation into ritual practice and the teachings by one's master was always an important characteristic of the esoteric Buddhist tradition. In other words, the emphasis of the Shingon Buddhist practice focused on the ritual and the methods of attaining enlightenment through, for example, the practice of the three mysteries of the body, speech, and mind, with the use of specific hand gestures as mudras, the chanting of specific mantras, and conceptualizing Buddhist deities. These were traditionally reserved for only those who were initiated by a master. In fact, many of the scriptures and ritual commentaries specifically prohibit sharing the secrets of these teachings to those who are not yet initiated into a tradition. It was the sense of secrecy in esoteric Buddhism that came into tension as the pressure grew to become public educators in Meiji Japan. With the newly created office of the doctrinal instructor in the 1870s, the Shingon Buddhist institution, as well as other Buddhist schools, were expected to propagate their teachings to the general public as part of an effort to educate. Discourses on the peace of mind as it developed in the Meiji period can be seen as one of the many ways Shingon Buddhists responded to the need to make their teachings more accessible to the general public. This posed many questions that needed to be addressed. What might the term peace of mind that came from the Pure Land tradition mean in the context of Buddhist teachings? What soteriological implications does it have, and how should they distinguish Shingon salvation from other Buddhist schools, specifically of Pure Land teachings, that have been far more successful in making their teachings accessible to a broader lay audience? In the production of treatises on the peace of mind and esoteric Buddhist teachings in the Meiji period, a careful negotiation can be seen that attempt to bridge traditional worldviews and ritual practices to address issues of individual salvation in a manner that was not seen in previous years of its history, especially in the way that the teachings needed to be presented, again, to a broader lay audience. Of course, this posed a problem for the Shingon school. To what extent does one disclose the secrets of the esoteric Buddhist teachings? How does one maintain secrecy while also making the teachings more comprehensible or comprehensible to the uninitiated? As mentioned earlier in the talk, one of the key components of Meiji reform was the establishment of a newly created office of the doctrinal instructor in an effort to have a more centralized program to educate the general population. This new position of the doctrinal instructor was made up of both lay members of the priesthood from both Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples who are required to preach loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. The establishment of the Daikyoin was an institutional symbol of collaboration between Shinto priests and Buddhist priesthood in an effort to proselytize a sense of loyalty to the emperor. However, due to conflicts and harsh backlash by Buddhists, in 1875, the Daikyoin as an institution was abolished, followed by the end of the Office of Religious Education in 1877. The abolishment of the Daikyoin and the Ministry of Religious Education pointed to the limitations in the initial vision of a trans-sectarian and religious cooperation between Shinto and Buddhist temples. However, at the same time, each Buddhist institution was now responsible to reevaluate their own teachings and to continue proselytizing efforts based on their own teachings among their individual schools. It's precisely at this moment when we start to see an active publication on treatises on anjin from the Shingon institutions. I'd like to spend the final part of the talk looking into specific examples of how these three treatises discuss peace of mind. In fact, it was in the 1876, just 1 year after the abolishment of the Daikyoin, that the Shingon monk Shakuryoki composed the summary of the peace of mind according to the esoteric teachings, published in 1877. A rather short work, this was written as a textbook that was meant to present a unified understanding of anjin, or peace of mind, that would be shared by Shingon preachers across different denominations. In it, he begins by presenting, let me skip this due to time. In it, one sees a clear attempt to clarify the esoteric Buddhist tradition based on traditional doctrines, while highlighting how it should be differentiated by the idea of a Pure Land as taught in other Buddhist schools, specifically the Shin Buddhist tradition. While it presents a fascinating view of the meaning of peace of mind using terms of esoteric Buddhism, there is undeniably a clear polemical element to the text in the way that it rejects the so-called mistaken view of Pure Lands. He explains, quote, "As for the unenlightened, the Mahavairochana Buddha, which is the cosmic Buddha in esoteric Buddhist cosmology, at its origins, these are not two separate bodies. However, it is due to the beginning's deluded performations that one forgets the enlightened body of Mahavairochana within them. As for their defiled world and the Pure Land, these two are also not separate places. It is the unenlightened sentient being who perceives the defiled world as such. In this sense, any Buddha that one perceives outside their own minds is not a true Buddha. This notion that there is a Pure Land separate from our perceived world, or the Saha world, is not a Pure Land. This is like attempting to remove the wave from water. If one sees the world as such, they will know that one's own mind is the Buddha, and that this world of delusion is the mysteriously adorned realm of Mahavairochana, and will attain the highest form of enlightenment. In final analysis, there is no Pure Land." End quote. In another passage, Shakuyoki explains that this so-called mysteriously adorned realm that is none other than the mind of the Buddhist practitioner. In final analysis of the meaning of the peace of mind in the Shingon school, Shakuyoki presents the possibility of a transformative perception of the Buddhist practitioner in which all delusion is seen as enlightenment, that the painful experience of birth and death is seen as nirvana, and that the unenlightened body is understood as none other than the body of the fully enlightened Buddha. Furthermore, he concludes that the peace of mind is attained with everything in the world, when everything in the world is seen as the resonating sounds of the Sanskrit letter A, including the Buddha realm, the realm of sentient beings, material realm, mountains, streams, the great ocean, the earth, grasses, and trees. When the world is viewed in this way, the actions of all people, regardless of their social status, whether monastic or lay, are understood as coexisting within the virtue of the sound of the letter A. Obtaining a peace of mind in the esoteric Buddhist teachings, according to Shakuyoki, is to understand one's true nature as resonating not only with the Mahavairochana Buddha, but also with all other beings and the rest of the material world, with the shared vibrancy of the breath of the cosmic Buddha through the sound of the letter A. While this discussion of the peace of mind is quite fascinating and clearly voiced in a manner that distinguishes itself from Pure Land teachings, one can also see how the focus of the peace of mind as discussed here remains within the mind of the esoteric Buddhist practitioner. In other words, it's a peace of mind that is attainable, according to this treatise, by one who is initiated. The question remains whether the message would actually resonate with the lay audience. In fact, this treatise by Shakuyoki, while perhaps help to unify the understanding of peace of mind within the different denominations of Shingon Buddhism, it was deemed too complicated for the regular lay audience. This is understandable, as the focus of this transformative perspective in the mind is in the mind of the esoteric Buddhist practitioner, not on specific practices and teachings of the regular lay person in a way that they might be able to incorporate into their own lives. This treatise on Anjin was followed by two other treatises that continued to elaborate on the peace of mind just 6 years later, by Shaku Unsho in his On the Meaning of Peace of Mind in the Esoteric Teachings, published in 1883, and another one that I will discuss a little bit later in 1884. Both of these treatises can be seen as addressing this issue of laity in ways that Shakuyoki's treatises did not. This discussion of the accessibility to the lay audience was a development seen in conjunction to broader discussions of the role of Shingon monks within the broader education campaigns in the Meiji government. In November and December of 1879, a series of conferences were held at the Reiunji Temple in Tokyo, which was meant to bring together all denominations of the Shingon establishment to discuss how to unify the Shingon school. In addition to discussions regarding the institutional restructuring of Shingon temples across Japan, there was also a call to unify the Shingon efforts in proselytizing its teachings to a broader lay audience. Through these discussions, it was decided that key members of different denominations of Shingon Buddhism will craft their understanding of Shui Anjin, or our school's understanding of peace of mind, again following the model of Shin Pure Land Buddhism, who have been more successful in their efforts to reach out to laity. When the group reconvened in the following year in 1880, Shaku Unsho was responsible for compiling this into a single treatise, which became published as On the Meaning of the Peace of Mind in the Esoteric Teachings, published in 1883. This was a far more detailed treatment of the Shingon interpretation of peace of mind and divided into 2 volumes, 16 chapters in all. At one point, Shaku Unsho explains that if the peace of mind in the Esoteric Buddhist teachings is an understanding of enlightened wisdom of Buddha is within oneself, in a matter similar to Shaku Ryoki's discussion above. However, Shaku Unsho further clarifies that this is specifically, quote, within the meditative concentration by the practitioner that all are equal through the chanting of mantras, forming of mudras, and the dedication of ritual implements such as incense and flowers that one obtains this understanding. In other words, this peace of mind is restricted to the esoteric Buddhist practitioner and not shared by the layperson. It's only when the esoteric ritual practitioner goes through the proper ritual initiation that they are endowed with the capability to remove obstructions from not only their own mind, but the mind of others. Shaku Unsho also clearly articulates that this is therefore the responsibility of the esoteric Buddhist master to embody this truth within themselves so that they can correctly instruct their lay followers. Again, the transformation is within the Buddhist practitioner himself and not the lay followers. One notices here too a tension in the explication of Shingon understanding of peace of mind in response to the need to make these teachings accessible on the one hand, but also maintaining a traditional stance on who has access to this experience. For Shaku Unsho, this distinction of peace of mind that is expressed by the esoteric Buddhist master is clearly differentiated from what is available to the lay practitioner. This tension and distinction between the peace of mind that is attainable for the practitioner of the esoteric Buddhist rites and that which is available to the non-initiated lay practitioner is most clearly articulated in Besho Eigon's Instructions on the Peace of Mind in Esoteric Teachings, published in 1884. This treatise is a compilation of very short sections divided into 21 topics. It's written in a much more accessible language, following the style of similar texts that were used in sermons given by Shin Pure Land Buddhists. According to Murakami Hiroko in her article Koya-san in Early Meiji, the brevity of each chapter reflects its practical use of the Shingon priest who may choose to read it as part of their sermon. While it repeats similar language of non-duality of the unenlightened and the Buddha as characteristic of esoteric Buddhist understanding of peace of mind, as seen in the treatises above, what is striking about this short text is that it makes a clear distinction between the different levels or capabilities of wisdom, suggesting that while the non-duality of self and Buddha is indeed the ultimate truth, it's only those endowed with superior wisdom that is able to immediately obtain the profound truth. Those with inferior wisdom, on the other hand, must rely on gradual methods of rebirth. In other words, there was a clear rejection of the rebirth. While there was a rejection of the rebirth in the Pure Land as a misleading teaching in earlier Anjin texts introduced today, Besho Eigon presents the possibility of Pure Land as an alternative path that is fit for those with lesser capabilities. For example, he explains that whereas people of greater capacities and wisdom attain immediate enlightenment, people of lower capacities and inferior wisdom who are not endowed with the ability to strive for this higher goal should proceed on the path toward enlightenment by being reborn into the Pure Land. With regards to the difference between Pure Land and the realm of suffering, Besho Egon explains again that from the ultimate standpoint, all realms are manifestations of Mahavajrayana Buddha, and yet continues to make a differentiation between the different levels of ability, suggesting that for people of lower capacities and inferior wisdom, the chanting of the mantra will lead them to a Pure Land that is separate from this world of suffering, and therefore they should commit their faith in the chanting of mantra in order to be reborn there. It's clear that this tension in the way that the peace of mind is discussed, that the differentiation between higher and lower capabilities was articulated in accordance to the audience or the imagined audience. Whereas earlier treatises of the peace of mind had the initiated esoteric practitioner in mind, here the audience was the uninitiated layperson. Negotiations of the peace of mind in Shingon circles during this time reflect a tension between the need to open up their teachings to the lay community, but also maintaining the traditional stance that there's a culture of secrecy that maintains that most profound experience are only for those who are properly initiated. For Besho Egon, his solution was to suggest that there was a value in the teachings of Pure Land, but that it was appropriate only for those with lesser capabilities. So in this presentation, I attempted to take a look at the various ways in which salvation was articulated within the esoteric Buddhist tradition, pointing to both discussions regarding earlier discourses regarding the subjugation of evil, which came under critique in a radically modernizing landscape of Meiji Japan, as well as how salvation in esoteric Buddhism was reimagined and articulated as a peace of mind in Meiji period. Much of this negotiation of reimagining esoteric Buddhist salvation can be seen and occurring not necessarily as a doctrinal necessity, but rather as a response to the shifting realities of the changing role of religious institutions. In the case of Shingon Buddhism in Meiji Japan, these shift in Meiji reforms regarding proselytization and the education of the masses became a catalyst to reconsider what aspects of its own tradition needed to be highlighted, and in some cases de-emphasized in the process of making its teachings more accessible to a broader lay audience. While earlier interpretations of the mind was based on the teachings of esoteric Buddhist scriptures that emphasized ultimate equality of all minds, one of the consequences of the continued negotiation led to the conclusion that a clear distinction needed to be made between the practices of esoteric Buddhist masters who were endowed with the greater capacities of wisdom, differentiated by those with so-called the lower capabilities. This tiered understanding of peace of mind also translated to ideas regarding differences in practices that were appropriate based on the capability of the person. The clear distinction of the different levels, ironically, may have further convinced advocates of New Buddhism to see Shingon Buddhism as fitting into the old form of Buddhism that advocated elitism, veiled in secrecy, and therefore opposed to the Unitarian ideals that called for the universality of Buddhism as a religion for the modern state. In this presentation, I was only able to look at 3 out of the many other treatises on anjin. So this is not by any means a conclusive study on the subject, but I hope that by highlighting some of the early discussions of peace of mind in Shingon Buddhism, it may lead to more discussions on how Shingon Buddhism themselves articulated their teachings in a rapidly changing world. Thank you all for listening.
Let's see, am I in the screen here? First, let me, thank you. Let me first give a warm thank you to Professor Swanson for that fascinating talk. There was so much there to get into, and I know we have a couple of questions. I thought that maybe I would just ask what I think is a more general question with regard that you raised in your framing of your argument. And that would kind of go back to the beginning. You talked about Joseph M. Storm's discussion of the invention of the category of religion in Meiji Japan. And he makes the argument that religion as a concept was invented in modernity. It can't be pushed back any further into pre-modernity in Japan's case. And that invention was also predicated on the invention of the idea of superstition magic, so that at the same time that religion was invented as a concept, superstition was invented as its kind of negative concept. And I think a lot of people have found that argument convincing, but one of the things that I picked up in your discussion is that while the modern opposition between these, let's say salvation and magic is not so sharply drawn in pre-modern Japan, there is a sense of tension. And I think you're returning to this term of negotiation. And one of the points that I like the most, because I've been really thinking about ennin and the Taigen, Suiho, and Shijo-koho, the rights that you were mentioning. The passage in the Shujitsu, I won't name the treatise that you're talking about, but he has an interlocutor being like, hey, ennin isn't, I'll just kind of paraphrase it in a simple way. Like, as we all know, I mean, isn't Buddhism about ahimsa? Isn't it about nonviolence? Isn't that the primary principle that is inviolable if we're going to be Buddhist here? How can your rights, where you're, if you look at Fudo Myo, I mean, he's a wrathful deity. He's a warrior. He has a sword and various other implements. He's killing people. How can you reconcile this violent imagery with our fundamental principle of like ahimsa, and which of course is central to the whole bodhisattva ideal, which is to attain enlightenment, which is a salvationary thing, and yet we're doing this thing that seems violent. There just seems to be something like I think that you really laid out well for us, that there was something like a tension between, let's say, magic and salvation already, and that kind of, how do you think that fits in with Josephson Storm's argument? So I'll leave it at that. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And yeah, that was something that I kind of really thought about when I was trying to make that kind of connection between the material of pre-modern Japan and this kind of subjugation rituals, and then negotiations in terms of the peace of mind. And I think that, as you just mentioned, Josephson's argument is interesting in that he says superstition, this kind of construct of the idea of superstition, goes hand in hand with the concept of religion itself, that you can't have one without the other. And I think to a certain extent, I agree with that, in the sense that the term superstition, or neither the term superstition or the term religion, shukyo, were terms that were used in pre-modern Japan, right? That I think there's certain associations with the term superstition that had a very kind of modern meaning. But I think, Ethan, what you were just saying, but at the same time, I think that when we do look at the pre-modern scriptures, the esoteric, the earliest esoteric scriptures, I think you do see a tension. It might not be voiced in terms of superstition and religion, because those terms, weren't used then. But I think they were, it's a tension in the sense of violence and compassion, for example. And I think what's important is some of the negative, what were kind of viewed as negative aspects of the superstitious, what were deemed superstitious, didn't become a problem. Now that we're in the modern age, we now have a clear conception of what is superstition and what is not. I don't think that's really the case. I think that there's different language being used, but there was a tension that needed to be overcome from very early on. And I think that's what's fascinating to me about pre-modern sources, is that I think that there might be a conception, I think, especially of this kind of new-old distinction of simplifying kind of the past as these kind of unwise, unable to make the distinction between superstition and wisdom. But I think it was much more complicated than that. And so I would maybe respond by saying this argument of superstition versus religion still stands in the sense that those two terms specifically were not applied to the past. But I think that absolutely there was a tension that I think is much more interesting to recognize in pre-modern, and which continued to the modern period. So there's less of a drastic cut, right, between pre-modern and modern, but more of I would say a continuation.
So thank you for making that point. I think one of the unintended consequences of Josephson Storm's argument is to underestimate the sophistication of pre-modern religious specialists, and that they were actually more sophisticated than we think. And I think that what your response illustrates that, and I thought your talk really demonstrated that beautifully. So So this, I'm in an interesting position where I'm listening and I'm having a back and forth with you, but there are also many very excellent questions, and I want to make sure I read those questions, deliver those questions to you on behalf of the audience. And what I'll do is just read them, and then we'll have a back and forth. So we'll read Professor Slober here, who's a professor of Indian religions here in my home department, Global Humanities and Religions. Asks, and I'll just read. Since the Taigen Sui ritual is supposed to have been imported to Japan, have you identified any Indian, Tibetan, or Chinese exemplars of the ritual, or do you think that it is likely it is a revised version of an older ritual in Japan that was just presented as imported for prestige?
Yeah, I think there is an indication that the scriptures did come from China. I'm not sure about Tibetan or Indian, but that I think it was a figure that has somewhat prominence in Chinese Buddhism. But I think what not to the extent that I think it was elevated in Japan due to the Jogyo and the Shingon tradition. So I think that what we do see is that through the specific decisions made by the Shingon tradition in Japan, certain kind of more less well-known, less central deities in the Chinese Buddhist canon were kind of elevated in ways. So I think, yes, it's not a complete apocryphal ritual in Japan, and yet I think it had a much more prominence in the way that it was able to, again, kind of argue that it was a necessary a ritual for the protection of the state.
And to go on to another question, it's kind of hard. I can't do follow-up, but and there are quite a few very interesting questions. So let me move on to a question from Professor Michiko Yusa, Professor Emerita of Western. And she asked, do you think the Shingon Buddhist effort to open up its teachings to the lay people actually succeeded in achieving its end? That is, did they increase the number of followers in Meiji Japan and afterwards? And then as a follow-up, any comments on female followers of Shingon also in the Meiji and post-Meiji periods?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I also see that you're a former colleague of my father, so nice to so I think I think in this particular presentation, I only focused on three and very specifically on the notion of anjin. And I think what you see happening is that the efforts to proselytize is not confined only in anjin discourse, but there's other forms as well. For example, I think even before this discussion of anjin, the Kobo Daishi Shinko, the focus on on Kukai as the savior, was one of the ways in which Koyasan specifically reached out as a possible way to get lay people to come to Koyasan, for example. And there's a lot of discussion about that as well. So I think that there's certain limitations that we can talk about of anjin discourse, but then that doesn't necessarily mean that they were completely unsuccessful in their larger efforts to reach out to the lay community. And I think another thing that I did want to mention was that one of the last treatises that I mentioned made a very kind of clear distinction between the higher capacities of the Shingon practitioners and then the lay practitioners, suggesting that the lay practitioners were kind of have less capacities, which I thought was a really unfortunate, personally, development of what kind of started off as a really fascinating topic. But a few years later, I think there's certain figures in the Shingon tradition who actually go back on that and say, no, there are certain kind of interpretations that really made the distinction between the different capabilities, but reverses that and says, no, if we're going to talk about Shingon anjin, then we should really talk about how this is salvation for all. So, so that particular treatment was not the final word. So that's kind of one thing that I wanted to put out there. But unfortunately, I just didn't have time to get into all of the different interpretations. One kind of interesting thing about the female followers of Shingon in one of the treatises, actually in the same treatise that I just mentioned, Aegon's treatise, he talks about female practitioners in the same way that it's often talked about as the female body being more defiled than the male body, and talks about salvation as in relationship to that. So I think I would say for that particular discussion, it's in line with what a lot of the other Buddhist institutions are doing, where they kind of fall onto this very male-centered, sexist interpretation of the female practitioner. So this is unfortunately not an exception in the case of the Shingon treatise as well.
Just as a quick follow-up, it really struck me how much that treatise by Besho Egon resembled Genshin's arguments in his Ojo Yoshu. It's the same rhetoric, and probably the same rhetoric about the female body as defiled. So, okay, let me get to it.
I mean, Ethan, that's a great point. I should also mention that particular rhetoric is actually based on a lot of pre-modern texts too, right? That distinction of the different capabilities. So
that was something I saw a lot, where the Meiji thinkers were using the resources of their tradition and just kind of like, I like how you said, de-emphasizing and highlighting, so kind of pushing this side, marginalizing one thing and emphasizing another. Okay, let me get to the next question. Professor Auerbach, thank you for a careful talk and the promise of hearing more about Shingon Buddhism in the modern period. Concerning the claims of Shingon scholars like Shaku Ryoki, to what extent were such claims novel to the Meiji period? Don't his claims largely recapitulate ideas from the ancient and medieval periods, like Kakukai's claims about, okay, I just saw this part, okay, about the imminence of the Pure Land. So we just had this thought, but maybe you could elaborate further on this. But particularly Kakukai as an example, yeah. Right,
so I think, yeah, like as Ethan just mentioned too, I think what's kind of fascinating about these texts is that that there is an attempt, or this kind of recognition, I think, that how can we reinterpret our teachings when there's kind of more and more discussions of how to kind of proselytize and make our teachings accessible. And I think the whole idea of focusing on anjin is based on this, the Pure Land, the Shin Pure Land Buddhists have really succeeded in making their teachings accessible through this kind of idea of anjin. So maybe we should try the same thing. But I think by like you say, by bringing in these teachings and basing their interpretations of this category of anjin on previous texts, on their own traditions, I think that there's a really strong tension of let's try to make this accessible, and yet they kind of fall into these medieval treatises. So what I found kind of quite interesting is that particular tension of these Shingon clerics who are trying to rethink how they can talk about their traditions, but then they're also kind of stuck because they have certain texts that are important to their tradition that they need to also abide by. So
okay, another question, and the next one we'll do Paride Stortini, and I'll ask the second question, which is at the bottom there, Eric, you might see it. An additional question on the concepts of secrecy and the public in the modern period. If I'm not wrong, I read in, I think it's Breen and Taeven, or one of those two, that already in the Edo period, part of the culture of secrecy and Tendai was reformed in response to the intellectual context of the Tokugawa shogunate. Do you find in Shingon a similar situation, or do you find more pressure to revise the category of the esoteric in the Meiji period? From the examples you raised, it seems that esoteric discourse is still useful to subordinate the lay or other sects to the initiated.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rita. I think that, yeah, I mean, it's I kind of skipped over a lot of in between my two kind of discussions, and there's so many interesting developments in the Edo period as well, in terms of how the information and just kind of this understanding of secrecy is being reevaluated in the Edo period. And so I think that the Meiji period is certainly kind of an extension of what's already happening in the Edo period. And I think in a lot of ways, I kind of focused on the Meiji period and specifically Anjin as kind of a, a kind of my perspective. But I think going back to Dr. Auerbach's question too, I think the what I see is a lot of not necessarily a clear break from the Meiji Restoration, but there's a lot of continuity in what's happening in the pre-modern period, in the Edo period, and in the Meiji period. And I think that I certainly wasn't able to articulate it well in this presentation, and it's something that I want to think more about. But I think there's this kind of tendency to think of Meiji as a sudden modernization. And I do wonder if there's kind of a way to talk about what these, not only Shingon clerics, but what kind of Buddhist clerics are doing as more of a continuation of what was going on in the Edo period and what was going on in the medieval period as well. So, yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, just to kind of place emphasis on that point, that was one of the things that I thought that you did really well and that I loved about your talk, highlighting or shedding light on the continuity between pre-modern and modern. I think it's so important, make an important contribution to our study of modern Japanese Buddhism. And let me move on to another question from Professor Brewster, Ernest Brewster. You mentioned the reformist Nakanishi Ushiro's idea of orienting a modern Japanese Buddhism away from arcane scholastic learning and towards an emphasis on faith as influential in Shingon circles during the Meiji period. But was there any effort to rehabilitate specifically Shingon conceptions of what having quote unquote faith means from reformist-minded scholars specifically trained in the Shingon tradition during this period? How did they differentiate their faith from that inculcated in Pure Land Buddhist traditions?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, and I certainly need to look into this more, but it's pretty clear from the treatises on Anjin that the Shingon clerics, at least writing about Anjin, I think partly because I think there's a recognition that it comes from from a Pure Land discussion. But there's a lot of emphasis on differentiating what the Shingon position or the Esoteric Buddhist position is of their understanding of faith and the understanding of Pure Land, and how that's different from the Pure Land school. So I think that there's a recognition that the Shingon clerics need to kind of reconceptualize what the idea of faith means in their particular tradition, particularly because I think that the Shin Pure Land Buddhists were so successful in doing that, in making their teachings accessible to a much broader audience in a way that I don't think the Shingon tradition were able to do. So, but I really kind of see, at least in the discourse of Anjin is this real attempt to reevaluate faith in what is Anjin, what does Anjin mean in Shingon terms, in Esoteric Buddhist terms, what does faith mean according to our tradition. And I think that was, so that there's kind of that intention on the one hand, but then I think it kind of going back to this another form of tension where in their attempt to reformulate faith in the Esoteric Buddhist tradition, it ends up being in some cases faith in the mind of the actual practitioner who's going through the ritual practice. And that has little to do with proselytization, right? Because that's not something that the lay audience can share in that experience. It's more about the experience of the one who's doing the preaching, right? So, so again, I think that tension is really interesting, and I hope to look into it a little bit more to see kind of the broader kind of implications of that. Thank you, Lily, for your question.
Okay, we're nearing the end of our time. I do want to ask one last question. This one's also about peace of mind, and it's by Andres Rovallo. And they ask, the state of peace of mind described by both Shaku Ryoiki and Shaku Unsho sounds very similar to the state of the natural mind found in Bon Tibetan Buddhist teachings. Is there a correlation between Shingon esoteric teachings and esoteric teachings in Tibet?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the correlations are basically based on shared scriptures. So I think that there's, of course, different ways in which the Tibetan tradition developed. But for example, the Mahavairochana Sutra is probably the most important esoteric treatise or scripture in Japanese Buddhism. And a lot of this discussion of the equality of the mind, I think in the commentary of the Mahavairochana Sutra, it basically asks, what is the meaning of the ultimate profound truth? And it's voiced as the ultimate equality of the Buddha, the mind of the Buddha, the mind of the practitioner, and the mind of all sentient beings. And this kind of notion of the non-duality of all minds that we see also kind of rehashed or used as the foundation of Anjin. I think you can read it back into the what's discussed, how the mind is discussed in scripture, like the Mahavairochana Sutra. So, so I think absolutely, I think there's a certain scriptural basis that are shared by these two traditions, and that kind of cross cultural comparison is actually quite fascinating.
Okay, so to close, I would like to give Eric a big thank you for the wonderful talk. Thank you, Professor Swanson. Applause, just us two. And thank you. And I also want to thank everyone for joining us today on a Friday evening, or maybe you're in a different time zone, wherever you are, whenever it is. We here at Western Washington and Global Humanities and Religions Department really appreciate your participation and attendance. And so we would also like to thank the Western Washington University Alumni Association for their partnership. And we'd like to thank all of you who chose to support the Department of Global Humanities and Religions as part of this webinar. Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you again, Professor Swanson.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.